Greetings, everyone. Here are the main points in today's video. NATO, the death sentence for Russia. NATO has just activated a top-secret super plan, pouring in a torrent of money, 4 times greater than any expectations, to strangle Vladimir Putin's war machine. How will this historic financial move become the verdict that determines the fate of Eastern Europe? And why is the Kremlin facing the risk of complete collapse? The White House turns its back on Russia. While Washington, under Donald Trump, suddenly froze all new aid sources, Europe was forced to take its own fate into its own hands with an unprecedented financial alliance. The Americans' disappearance from the battlefield, betrayal, or a trap forcing continental powers into a self-reliant holy war to defend their borders? Doomsday superweapons, 20 million troops deployed, unleashing a devastating strike to destroy 180,000 Russian military targets. Western intelligence has just issued an urgent warning that Russia is quietly stationing 115,000 troops right next to NATO, ready for a full-scale campaign in 2029. Here is the content and detailed analysis of NATO's death sentence for Russia as they launch a devastating strike to destroy 180,000 Russian military targets. Ladies and gentlemen, the global geopolitical landscape is witnessing a pivotal turning point as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has just activated a bold strategic move toward the Ukrainian battlefield. Right now, the world's largest collective defense alliance is urgently finalizing a top-secret reinforcement plan to provide Ukraine with an ultimate weapon to end this war of attrition once and for all. If this plan is officially approved by NATO, and all signs on the geopolitical chessboard indicate that it will, President Vladimir Putin will have to face extremely severe consequences. This intervention will not only completely change the situation on the current Eastern European battlefield, but also shatter Moscow's long-term strategic calculations regarding NATO's eastern flank in the post-conflict scenario. This entire chain reaction was, in fact, triggered by a calculated diplomatic move from Kyiv officials. An anonymous senior Ukrainian defense official revealed that in mid-June, the country was preparing to put forward a decisive proposal at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting, also known as the Ramstein format. This is the highest level forum for the West to legitimize military aid packages. And this time, Kyiv's objective was outlined more clearly than ever. The Ukrainian representative frankly stated that the flames of conflict are consuming Russia's resources, and to push the situation to a complete breaking point, Kyiv needs a huge amount of funding. The figure given was $20 billion an ambitious budget plan, but one that has been carefully calculated. Kyiv's plan is to urge each key allied country in NATO to contribute between $2 and $6 billion either as direct military aid or as long-term reconstruction loans. For a country like Ukraine, which has to allocate up to 40% of its gross domestic product to the war machine, this additional $20 billion would provide a huge boost. It adds significant weight to the $38 billion budget that NATO has already committed for 2022. With Kyiv getting close to the $60 billion aid target that NATO Secretary General Mark Zatter outlined back in May, Ukraine is ready to put all its cards on the negotiating table. However, Kyiv probably won't have to wait passively for a nod from Brussels. As information about this demand emerged, the NATO heads of state clearly were already one step ahead. They knew what would happen at Ramstein and had prepared a response scenario that exceeded all expectations. Ukraine only requested $20 billion, but the response from this military alliance would astonish the whole world because they did not stop at just that small amount. NATO's next move will put the Kremlin in a completely passive position. This alliance is preparing a major financial package for the only country directly holding back Russia's expansion in Europe. This monetary intervention is likened to a critical blow delivered straight to the lifeblood of the military campaign initiated by Moscow, ensuring Ukraine a steady budget flow that far exceeds the initial expectations of the Kyiv government. Instead of the modest $20 billion proposed by Ukraine, NATO is moving very close to a general consensus to raise the total aid amount to over $80 billion. This will be a comprehensive military funding source for Ukraine during the crucial remaining phase of 2026. If this process goes smoothly, this $80 billion super aid package will be officially announced at the NATO summit held in Ankara, Turkey. This will be a landmark diplomatic and military victory for Ukraine. This pivot ensures that the brutal war of attrition launched by Russia will not be able to strangle Ukraine simply because of a depleted defense budget. It was from the ruins of the old mechanism that the $80 billion plan initiated by Germany quickly gained consensus thanks to its flexibility and practicality. Instead of binding members to a fixed percentage of GDP, this new mechanism cleverly integrates and synergizes with the loans that the European Union had previously committed. Diplomatic observers revealed that Germany's draft plan had calculated to include nearly $35 billion from EU loan funds. This means that NATO members only need to arrange about $45 billion more through bilateral aid programs. This is the sweetener that makes it easier for alliance members to accept at the Jamstein format, because the total amount they actually have to spend is much lower than the scenario imposed by the initial GDP ratio, while Ukraine still receives a superior resource at the Ankara summit. In terms of financial transfers, this commitment marks a sudden increase in the scale of aid, even though NATO members had previously maintained a considerable defense budget for Kyiv. Even during previous intense fighting, Berlin continuously injected nearly $5 billion USD in just 2 months for Ukraine to strengthen its air defense system and drone fleet. At the same time, London also dispersed nearly $1.5 billion USD in addition to hundreds of millions of USD contributed by other allies. Clearly, Europe is not stingy, but the upcoming financial flow represents a qualitative change. They are not only helping Ukraine hold out, but are also preparing for a new phase of total war. This effort by NATO reflects a strategic compromise between protecting the national interests of each member and the existential obligation to Ukraine. Overcoming seemingly irreconcilable differences, Germany's proposal has brought the alliance very close to a financial resource that far exceeds even the boldest expectations of its officials. The quadrupling of the $20 billion figure, which began right after the Alcazar summit, is not simply a matter of numbers, but carries a vital geopolitical significance. For NATO, entering the battlefield in Ukraine is not simply an act of altruism or humanitarian aid, but a highly self-interested defensive calculation. Right now, as Russia's military infrastructure along the borders with Finland, Sweden, Norway, and the Baltic states is being rapidly upgraded and modernized, international monitoring sources confirm that these bases are being expanded to accommodate a massive force of up to 115,000 troops. At the same time, Moscow continuously launches hybrid warfare attacks to test the bloc's response. The decision to inject more than $80 billion into the war effort is not simply an act of aid, but a strong testament that the military alliance has awakened to an obvious reality. NATO needs Ukraine more than ever. Although Kyiv's official membership status remains a sensitive red line, enough to push the Kremlin into extreme rage with unpredictable reactions, no one can deny that this country has steadfastly played the role of a solid front line, bearing the full brunt of the historic confrontation that Moscow has aimed at the West for more than 4 long years. President Volodymyr Zelensky once affirmed this situation with a powerful statement, saying that the hard-earned experience gained by the Ukrainian army on the battlefield is an invaluable asset that no amount of money can buy. That is the core strategic weapon, and sharing it is entirely in NATO's vital interest. Even though the doors of Brussels will not open for Kyiv as long as the war continues, Ukraine's strategic value at this moment has already surpassed that of many official key members. Researchers from the European Council on Foreign Relations warn that any scenario ending the conflict without a complete victory for Ukraine will give the Kremlin a precious pause to rebuild its position and prepare for a full-scale campaign to seize the eastern flank of the West as expected. That's why this fight for survival is not just for Kyiv alone. The massive commitment for this crucial phase in 2026 sends a dual message. It both honors Ukraine's role as a resilient shield and serves as a cold splash of water on Vladimir Putin's war of attrition. The Kremlin never planned for its opponent to receive such a powerful flow of financial support, a strategic move aimed at crushing any future expansionist ambitions of Russia before they can reach the rest of the continent. However, in this fierce geopolitical gamble, a vast power vacuum has emerged in what was once the center of all U.S.-led coalition attention. Since President Donald Trump entered the White House, Washington has shifted from being the chief architect to becoming a risky and unpredictable variable. The relationship between Kiev and Washington over the past 18 months has gone through turbulent ups and downs. Although the situation has somewhat calmed down, the harsh reality is that aid from across the Atlantic is no longer as abundant as before. The rare shipments of weapons arriving at the battlefield are mostly leftovers from commitments made under the previous Joe Biden administration. Meanwhile, in-depth reports from think tanks point out a harsh truth. Not a single new financial commitment has been approved by Washington. This turning away is even more evident in military reports from the Militani news portal. When the record $1.5 trillion defense budget draft for 2027 proposed by the Donald Trump administration is completely missing any provisions for Ukraine. The era of multi-billion-dollar aid packages under Joe Biden seems to have come to an end. This forces Europe to seek its own compromise solution, called an initiative, a list of requirements or priorities for Ukraine, also known as the Pay-US PUGL mechanism, which is essentially a clever diplomatic buffer that allows European allies to use their own budgets to buy weapons from American defense corporations and then transfer them to Ukraine. This scenario lets Washington keep its economic revenue while avoiding the image of directly funding the war. But it also cements the reality that Ukraine cannot count on new funding from the White House under the current administration. It is precisely that isolation that has cast a bittersweet meaning on NATO's $80 billion aid package. Now is when Europe's great powers must step up to fill the power vacuum left by the Americans. Although Canada's role remains a question mark, Washington's absence has forced Europe to shoulder its own destiny. Nevertheless, the small sparks of hope from the American Congress have not been completely extinguished, as the Armed Services Committee has just voted to pass the bill. The extension of the $750 million aid package in the 2027 budget has passed through countless obstacles and debates in both houses of Congress. Kai still hopes this will be a spark for the revival of American aid, accompanying the financial shield that Europe is building. For Ukraine, this $80 billion lifeline is a lifesaver for an economy on the brink of exhaustion due to the devastation of war. Field reports from the BBC describe the situation as a fierce and urgent financial front, no less critical than the gunfire on the front lines. Amidst the situation where Kiev's government spending is expected to reach $112 billion, with $60 billion going directly into military operations, Ukraine's economy is bearing a massive budget deficit of up to $45 billion. Strangely enough, and also perfectly, this $45 billion figure is exactly the core amount that Germany's plan aims to mobilize. It matches perfectly with the approximately $35 billion that has already been guaranteed from the European Union's funding structure. These financial pieces are fitting together so perfectly, almost as if by fate, revealing the truth that the West is putting all its efforts into patching Ukraine's survival gap before it's too late. Entering the most intense phase of the conflict, Kiev has already mapped out a carefully calculated plan for using these funds, with advanced air defense systems and drone fleets given top priority. The reality on the battlefield has proven that drone fleets are becoming the decisive weapon, completely breaking the back of the large-scale offensive campaign designed to strangle Ukraine. At the NATO Parliamentary Assembly session, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Mstislav Balik brought some astonishing news. Ukraine's internal capabilities can completely raise drone production to an unimaginable level. 20 million units per year, as long as Western allies provide adequate financial support. This number is 5 times last year's total output and is achievable if NATO accepts Berlin's proposal. The presence of Ukrainian drone squadrons is creating significant geopolitical and military shifts on the battlefield. This technological advantage has been concretely demonstrated by telling figures in just 1 month. The Ukrainian military has struck 180,000 Russian military targets, marking a nearly 13-fold increase compared to the previous month. General Oleksandr Shishky, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, confirmed that Ukraine is dominating the enemy with a 1.5-to-1 ratio on the FPV drone front. Not stopping there, Kiev has established a solid defensive network using interceptor drones, completely neutralizing the threat from Russian drone squadrons, while also accumulating a medium-range reserve stockpile capable of crippling the entire logistics and supply chain system of the Kremlin. When all the core military achievements that Ukraine is currently attaining are multiplied 5-fold thanks to financial aid from NATO, how dramatically will the battlefield situation be reversed? Russia will no longer be in a stalemate, but will be forced to retreat and withdraw en masse in the face of the devastating power of Ukraine's attacks. That is not a distant scenario, but a grim future awaiting the Russian army. A scenario where success or failure depends entirely on the decisions made at the upcoming Ankara summit. All eyes of international observers are now focused on this high-level conference to see whether the massive $80 billion aid package will truly prove decisive in the war. So, in your opinion, with such widespread support and assistance, can Ukraine truly push back the Russian army completely?